friend gave her a phone as a gift. What she found on it ended up in a jail cell, and a case that's still not over. We're on the case presented by Hollow Signal. My name is Zokora8. Every parent who has ever handed their child over to a babysitter has felt that small flicker of doubt in the doorway. The second thought before pulling out of the driveway. Most of the time, that doubt is nothing. But in one New Jersey community, a mother's doubt turned out to be the only thing standing between her son and a nightmare that had already been happening, quietly, on a stranger's phone. This is the case of Victoria Cranmer, a 25-year-old babysitter now sitting in an Ocean County jail cell, held without bail, accused of one of the most disturbing betrayals a caregiver can commit. Before we get into the allegations, it's worth understanding who Cranmer is, at least as far as the public record and her own words allow. By most accounts, she was active on social media and not shy about sharing details of a difficult upbringing. In posts reviewed online, she described a childhood marked by loss and instability, a father who died when she was 13 on Christmas Day, being separated from her parents at 11, moving more than 36 times before she was even an adult, sitting in therapy sessions by the age of 10. We mention this not to generate sympathy. It would be difficult to feel much of that once you hear what she's accused of, but because understanding the person at the center of a case like this is part of understanding how it unfolded. The story takes place in Ocean County, New Jersey, in the southern half of the state, closer to Philadelphia than to New York City, north of Atlantic City. According to court records, everything traces back to May 20th, when the New Jersey Division of Child Protection and Permanency was contacted by local police in Little Egg Harbor. That division exists to investigate exactly this kind of concern, possible abuse or neglect involving a child. The trigger, according to a probable cause affidavit obtained by a New Jersey news outlet, was a mother, identified in court paperwork only as Miss H, who came forward with concerns about her young son, believed to be somewhere between the ages of 4 and 13. Cranmer had been the boy's babysitter. Miss H told investigators she had already cut ties with Cranmer, alarmed by changes in her son's behavior, and by something another mother had told her. That second woman, referred to in records as Miss P, had her own connection to Cranmer. The two were more than acquaintances. Cranmer had actually lived with Miss P for roughly 3 months, and during that time she also babysat Miss P's daughter. According to the court documents, Miss P said Cranmer had been struggling with mental health issues during her stay. At one point, wanting to do something kind, Miss P bought Cranmer a birthday gift, a cell phone. That phone would become the single most important piece of evidence in this entire case. As Cranmer's mental health struggles reportedly worsened, Miss P made the difficult decision to ask her to move out, but told her to leave the phone behind. It's unclear exactly what prompted that condition, but it would prove to be a devastating one for Cranmer, and a critical break in the investigation. Once Cranmer was gone, Miss P looked through the phone. What she allegedly found was a 14-second video saved in the Memories section of Cranmer's Snapchat account, a feature that privately archives a user's own saved content. According to investigators, that video shows Cranmer sexually abusing a child in the bathroom of a home where she had been working as a babysitter. Authorities allege that, in the video, Cranmer can be heard laughing while committing the abuse. Police say the video was recorded on May 6th, meaning it had been sitting on that phone, hidden in a private archive, for roughly 2 weeks before it was discovered entirely by accident. Not through any investigation, but because a friend trying to help a struggling young woman happened to look through a phone she'd been asked to hold onto. If that had been the end of it, one video, one incident, it would already be almost impossible to comprehend. But investigators say it wasn't the end. Once police obtained the device and began a full forensic examination of both the phone and Cranmer's Snapchat account, they say they found additional videos stored in that same Memories feature. As of the most recent reporting, authorities have not disclosed publicly what those additional videos show, only that they exist, and that they've been referenced in the court paperwork tied to this case. That detail alone raises the kind of questions that keep an investigation open long after the first charges are filed. Was the first video an isolated act, or part of a pattern? Is there more than one victim? Those questions remain unanswered, at least publicly for now. It's worth pausing here on just how ordinary the circumstances were. There was no elaborate sting operation, no tip from a confidential informant, no months-long surveillance effort. A woman did a kind thing. She gave a struggling friend a place to stay and a phone as a gift. And in doing so, she unknowingly held on to the one piece of evidence that would eventually end.
So I don't think that the timeline is particularly remarkable or really egregious in this case. I think any time an investigative body takes the time it needs to do a thorough investigation, to do what's colloquially referred to as a cell phone dump, to do the forensic analysis they need to do of cell phone contents or video contents and the native files that are attached to the evidence that may be produced from those devices, I think is a good thing. So I don't interpret this lag time, as it were, between the information being provided or allegations having been made and the complaint issued or the warrant issued in this case. I think it likely was the time that the police needed to do their investigation and get the reliable evidence that they needed to substantiate the warrant application.
That friend's freedom.
And then there are these.
It's the kind of detail that tends to stick with people long after a case like this fades from the headlines. How close this might have stayed buried if a phone had simply been handed back instead of left behind. It also raises the uncomfortable question every parent eventually has to sit with. Background checks, references, gut instinct. None of it is foolproof. Predatory behavior, when it exists, is often designed to be invisible until it isn't. In this case, according to the mother identified as Miss H, it was her son's behavior that first raised a flag, long before anyone knew about a hidden video. That's a detail investigators and child advocates alike tend to emphasize. Changes in a child's demeanor, sleep, or behavior around a particular caregiver are sometimes the only early warning a parent gets. About 2 months passed between the discovery of that first video and the moment charges were formally filed, July 7th. That gap is worth sitting with for a moment. 2 months of an investigation quietly moving forward, evidence being reviewed, forensic reports being compiled, all while, presumably, Cranmer continued living her life with no idea the walls were closing in. Or perhaps every idea. We don't know which. What we do know is that by the time cameras were rolling on her arrest, the case against her had already been built, piece by piece, out of public view. In our next part, we'll walk through exactly what Cranmer is charged with, what her mugshot and jail status tell us about how seriously prosecutors are treating this case, and what a former sex crimes prosecutor says about how digital evidence like this actually holds up, or falls apart, in a courtroom. When Victoria Cranmer's mugshot surfaced, it spread quickly. The kind of image that stops people mid-scroll. There's something about a mugshot that flattens a person into a single moment. No context, no explanation, just a face and a jail intake number. For a lot of people encountering this case for the first time, that photo will be the entirety of what they know about Victoria Cranmer. It's worth remembering that behind it is a much longer, much more complicated legal process, one that's really only just beginning. She's currently being held in the Ocean County Jail without bail, which alone tells you how seriously the court is treating the allegations against her. Judges don't deny bail lightly. It typically signals either a flight risk, a danger to the community, or both. According to court records, Cranmer faces 4 separate charges. The most serious is sexual assault of a victim older than 4 years old. Alongside that, she's charged with second-degree manufacturing of child sexual abuse material, third-degree endangering the welfare of a child, and third-degree possession of child sexual abuse material. 2 of those charges, manufacturing and possession, point directly to that 14-second video. Prosecutors allege she didn't just commit the abuse, but recorded it and kept it. As of the most recent public reporting, it remains unclear what the additional videos investigators say they found actually depict, or whether more victims may be identified as the case develops. It's also unclear whether additional charges could still be filed, and online court records have not yet listed a date for Cranmer's next court appearance. To understand how a case like this actually moves through the legal system, we spoke with a law professor and former sex crimes prosecutor who spent years handling exactly this kind of evidence. One of the first questions worth asking is about timing. Nearly 2 months passed between the initial report to Child Protective Services and the filing of charges. According to the former prosecutor, that gap isn't unusual or a red flag. If anything, it's often a sign of a case being built carefully. Digital evidence like this requires what investigators sometimes call a phone dump, a full forensic extraction of everything on a device, followed by detailed analysis of video files, metadata, and the underlying code that comes attached to them. Rushing that process risks the entire case falling apart later. Taking the time to do it right, she explained, is generally a good sign for the strength of a prosecution, not a weakness. But timing isn't the only hurdle. There's also the question of how digital evidence, especially video, actually gets treated once it reaches a courtroom. It might seem like a recorded video is the end of the argument. Play it for a jury, and the case proves itself. According to the former prosecutor, it's not that simple. Before any video can be shown to a jury, the prosecution has to clear an evidentiary hurdle, proving the footage is authentic, that it hasn't been altered or tampered with, and, increasingly in the era of artificial intelligence, that it isn't a fabrication. Courts now have to consider the possibility that video evidence could theoretically be manipulated or artificially generated, and legal systems are still catching up, with several jurisdictions actively working to update their rules of evidence to account for AI-generated content. That's a strange and relatively new wrinkle in cases like this. A decade ago, a video like the one described in this case would have been treated as close to irrefutable, the kind of evidence a defense attorney would have very little room to challenge. Today, even genuine footage can face questions it never used to face, simply because the technology to convincingly fabricate video now exists. It's a reminder of how quickly the legal system has had to adapt to tools that didn't exist when many of its current rules of evidence were first written. If the authenticity of a video were ever challenged in a case like this, prosecutors might need to lean on more than just the footage itself. According to the former prosecutor, that can mean asking the child at the center of the case to testify directly. A heartbreaking possibility, given that even one appearance in open court can be re-traumatizing for a young survivor. As reliable as forensic video evidence can be, sometimes the most powerful form of corroboration in a courtroom is still a human being describing what happened to them. Then there's the matter of Cranmer's own defense. Publicly disclosed mental health struggles, the kind she referenced in her own social media posts, could become relevant, but likely not to argue innocence outright. According to the former prosecutor, a defense built around mental illness in a case like this would typically be framed as an inability to form intent, arguing the defendant wasn't acting knowingly or voluntarily. That's sometimes called a guilty but mentally ill defense. And even if successful, it wouldn't erase the underlying conduct. It could, at most, affect sentencing or push for mandated treatment as part of any final outcome. There's also a narrower legal strategy that could come into play, separating possession from production. If Cranmer's defense could establish that she saved a video rather than personally created it, it might chip away at specific charges. Though, as the former prosecutor was careful to point out, that wouldn't wipe the slate clean. Possession of child sexual abuse material remains a serious charge on its own, regardless of who filmed it. As for what comes next, the former prosecutor explained that any real negotiation between the defense and prosecution likely won't begin until the discovery process is complete, meaning the defense gets full access to the phone, the forensic reports, and the footage itself, along with the opportunity to have their own independent analyst review everything. Only after that, and likely after some form of mental competency evaluation, would plea discussions realistically start. And only if prosecutors are open to that path at all. There's also the matter of what happens if more charges get added down the line. A real possibility, given that investigators say they're still working through the additional videos found on Cranmer's phone. According to the former prosecutor, joining multiple sets of charges into a single trial isn't automatic. A defense attorney would likely object, and for good reason. When a jury hears about a high volume of alleged incidents rather than just one, there's a natural human tendency to assume that where there's smoke, there's fire. Even if each individual allegation should, in theory, be weighed entirely on its own merits. A pretrial judge would ultimately have to decide whether any additional charges get tried alongside the current ones, or handled separately. It's a reminder that a case like this rarely moves in a straight line. Every piece of digital evidence has to be authenticated, every additional file has to be reviewed, and every procedural step, from the initial forensic phone dump to a potential competency evaluation, adds weeks or months before a courtroom ever sees a jury. For a case that began with one mother's concern and one friend's decision to look through a phone, the legal road ahead is now considerably longer and more complicated. In our final part, we'll look at what social media evidence like this actually involves behind the scenes, how investigators pull data from platforms like Snapchat, and what happens next for a young victim who may eventually have to face the person accused of hurting them. Inside a courtroom, cases like this one increasingly hinge on something most of us carry in our pockets every day: a phone and whatever's quietly stored inside apps we barely think about. In Cranmer's case, prosecutors say the most damning evidence wasn't hidden in an encrypted folder or a deleted files archive. It was sitting in Snapchat's Memories feature, a place most users think of as a private scrapbook for saving their own photos and videos. We asked a former sex crimes prosecutor and current law professor what it actually looks like when investigators request evidence from a platform like Snapchat. Her answer? It varies enormously by platform, and every service presents its own set of challenges. Investigators have to figure out how to properly submit a subpoena, how to freeze an account before evidence can be altered or deleted, and how to ensure they're getting an accurate snapshot of what existed on that account at a specific point in time. What comes back from a platform can range widely. Sometimes it's a series of screenshots pulled from a specific username or account. Other times it includes far more: metadata like IP addresses, account activity logs, and in some cases the actual content of communications. What investigators ultimately receive depends heavily on the exact wording of the warrant or subpoena and what the platform itself is legally able to disclose. That process, freezing an account, requesting records, waiting on a company's legal compliance team, then running a full forensic breakdown of whatever comes back, is a major reason cases like this can take weeks or months to move from initial report to formal charges. It's slow, methodical, and often invisible to the public until charges are finally announced. There's another piece of this case worth sitting with: the road ahead for the child at the center of it. Assuming this case does eventually go to trial, the former prosecutor described the kind of preparation that goes into getting a young victim ready to testify. And it's nothing like what gets shown in movies. It's not a rushed conversation the night before a hearing. According to her, the process ideally begins as early as possible, sometimes even before formal charges are filed, with the prosecutor's office staying in regular contact with the family to explain what's ahead and check on the child's well-being. This is also where victim witness advocates, social workers, and case managers become essential. They're not lawyers, and they're not there to argue legal strategy, but they're often the ones who walk a frightened child and family through an unfamiliar and intimidating system, sometimes literally holding their hand through a process that can be re-traumatizing even when it's necessary. There's also the broader question of whether a case like this even needs to reach a jury at all. According to the former prosecutor, there's always a balancing act between protecting a young victim from having to relive their trauma in open court and pursuing what both sides might consider a just outcome. Sometimes that balance points toward a negotiated resolution instead of a trial. A decision typically shaped less by which side blinks first, and more by what best protects the child while still holding a defendant accountable. Legally, Cranmer is protected during any negotiation process too. Under the rules of evidence, prosecutors can't use the simple fact that a defendant engaged in plea discussions against them later, meaning even exploratory conversations about a potential deal wouldn't automatically be treated as an admission of guilt if those talks fell apart and the case went to trial anyway. There's a broader pattern worth noting here too, one that shows up again and again in cases like this. A decade ago, an investigation like this might have hinged on physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, or a confession. Today, it's just as likely to hinge on a cloud backup, a memories folder, or a metadata timestamp buried inside an app most people use to send silly photos to friends. Digital forensics teams have become as central to child abuse investigations as detectives once were, and platforms like Snapchat, Instagram, and others now maintain entire legal compliance divisions dedicated to handling exactly these kinds of law enforcement requests. That shift cuts both ways. It means evidence can survive in places people don't expect: a private archive feature, a synced backup, a deleted file that isn't quite as deleted as someone assumed. But it also means cases can take longer to build, because that evidence has to be requested, preserved, and authenticated through a legal process most people never see. For families waiting on updates, that gap between an arrest and a resolution can feel unbearable. For prosecutors, it's often the difference between a case that holds up in court and one that doesn't. It's also worth remembering that cases like this rarely end cleanly and rarely end quickly. Even after an arrest makes headlines, the actual legal process can stretch on for a year or more. Discovery, motions, evaluations, and, if it comes to that, a trial. The public attention tends to fade long before the courtroom work is finished. For the family at the center of this case, that means the hardest part may still be ahead of them, largely out of view. As it stands, the investigation appears far from finished. Online court records have not listed a date for Cranmer's next appearance. It remains unclear what the additional videos investigators say they discovered on her phone actually show, whether more victims could eventually be identified, and whether more charges are still coming. For now, Victoria Cranmer remains in the Ocean County Jail, held without bail, facing 4 charges connected to a single 14-second video that a friend never should have had to find. This story is still developing, and as with any active case, everything outlined here reflects allegations at this stage, not a proven verdict. Cranmer, like any defendant, is presumed innocent unless and until a court says otherwise. We'll continue following this case as it moves through the New Jersey court system, and we'll update you the moment new charges, hearing dates, or details come to light. That's it for the case presented by Hollow Signal. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Facebook. I'm Zocora8. See you next time.